Welcome back. Western nations have rejected Volodymyr Zelensky's call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. In a Zoom call yesterday with some 300 U.S. lawmakers, Zelensky also said a ban on purchasing Russian oil would have greater impact than other economic sanctions. So as we did last week, we brought together a couple of experts to discuss the war and its implications. Admiral James Stavridis is the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. And Fiona Hill was President Trump's chief advisor on Russia. She's also the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Sort of a memoir-ish. Of your time in the UK. Fiona Hill, I want to start very quickly. I want you to respond to Ambassador Haley in what she said about the Trump administration's record on Russian sanctions. She kept saying, well, you noted he tried. How would you describe his efforts when it comes to punishing Russia versus the administration's?
Well, certainly there was an awful lot done by the administration, also by Congress and by Ambassador Haley herself at the United Nations. But I think that just the one point that sums everything up that you yourself touched on is that President Trump, at a pretty critical period, withheld military assistance to Ukraine that was desperate for it at that particular juncture, basically to get Volodymyr Zelensky to do him a personal favour.
And what message does that send to Putin?
Well, that sends a message to Putin that Ukraine is a plaything for himself as well and for the United States, and that nobody's really serious about protecting Ukraine. And that was ultimately a sign of weakness. It's our political divisions, our partisan infighting, which was on full display there, that Putin, I think, is quite shocked now that we've got some collective action together.
Admiral, I want you to listen to Kira Rudik. She's a Ukrainian member of parliament, and this was her plea when it came to the no-fly zone. Take a listen.
We all know that also the next step that we see is a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And I know that everybody is saying, no, 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 the Third World War will start. I will be very blunt with you. It has already started.
All right, we have the map up. Logistically, how doable is this? And why are so many folks in the United States adamant about not even attempting it?
Let me start with the back end, because I think it's really the important question. It's quite obvious that if we put U.S. NATO jets in the air enforcing a no-fly zone, they'll be going nose-to-nose with Russian fighter aircraft. Down that path, the potential for miscalculation in a war between NATO and Russia and a war between Russia and the United States rises significantly. Look, I implemented a no-fly zone. I know how to do this. I did it in Libya in 2011. Can we do it? Sure. Should we? Not yet. But final point, Chuck, what we ought to do is give the Ukrainians the ability to create a no-fly zone, more Stingers, more missiles that can go higher than Stingers, and above all, consummate this fighter deal, get those MiG-29s in their hands.
Do our NATO allies that have these Russian jets have enough of them to give the Ukrainians a chance at air superiority?
Yes. And by the way, take a look at NATO combat aircraft. We have over 25,000. Russian combat aircraft, around 5,000. We outnumber them 5-1 as an alliance. Hey, we outspend them 15-1. We outnumber them in ground troops 4-1. He's not going to cross a NATO border in anger, but we ought to do all that we can to support the Ukrainians.
Fiona Hill, the tweet heard around the world was the Lindsey Graham tweet having to do with the idea that, hey, somebody's got to take him out. Frankly, it's something that plenty of people have talked about. Admiral Stavridis and I talked about the Julius Caesar solution on a podcast a couple weeks ago. Do you expect Putin to lead Russia if this war ends?
Look, I think we've got to be very careful for the same reasons that Admiral Stavridis is talking about, taking extremely care with the no-fly zone about this kind of talk right now. Right. Because one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin is engaging in this appalling behaviour in Ukraine is because he's worried about his own position. Yeah. He has to be re-elected in theory and also in practice in 2024. So we're running up until his own presidential time clock here. If he fails and looks weak, that's disastrous at home, not just abroad. And any kind of loose talk about somebody taking him out, regime change, he believes that we're in that business anyway. He looks at what the United States has done, and he says it openly all the time, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and many other places where we've intervened, And he looks at that and he thinks, I'm not going to let that happen here in Russia. He is extremely paranoid about this. And one of the reasons that he wants to destroy Ukraine is because he thinks that we would use it, because he would think about using it as a launching pad for something like this. So we have to be extraordinarily cautious about how we talk about this conflict. We need to stop the war in Ukraine, but we have to be very careful about talking about war with Russia, regime change over these other things, because then he absolutely will double down further.
And yet, Jim, how does this end with him in power?
I think it's increasingly hard to see that simply because the behavior we're seeing are war crimes. Let's call it what it is. When you fire artillery into residential areas, when you bomb civilians, when you attack a nuclear power plant, you are committing war crimes. And increasingly, that is going to have to be taken into account as this ends. How does it end? Let's look back at the Balkans. I think if we look back in history, we had similar kind of situations, differences, but similar in the 1990s.
We were never going to go in, though. And eventually we went in. I mean, I was just going to say, I've been thinking about that a lot. We said we weren't going to go in. I remember all of those pledges.
Yeah.
And we couldn't stand watching this humanitarian crisis.
And, Chuck,
and we intervened.
This is precisely what's unfolding. And maybe the biggest weapon we have is truth, is showing the Russians what their leader is creating in their name.
But will the Russians see the truth?
Well, what we're going to have to do is to try to keep on basically pushing this at every possible juncture that we can. Look, there's an awful lot of Russian oligarchs, business people are out there whose assets are being seized, which can be used, in fact, to try to support the Ukrainians, for example. But we've got to really work on the broader world of public opinion in the United Nations. We've got to get the Chinese. I know we've got a lot of skepticism about that, but Indians and others who've been, basically sitting on the fence to try to push this too, because this is an atrocity that the whole world can't basically stand by and watch. So that's where we're going to have to focus for right now to see what we can do to get this to stop.
Admiral Stavridis and Fiona Hill, thank you both.
Thanks.
Really,
Thank you.
Really helpful.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.